Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Searching the Sacred. Steph, Lisa, and Jason here with you. We are launching into season 10. Can you believe 10 seasons of Searching the Sacred? We are now double digits. We're almost a teenager. This is amazing, and we are excited to be back with you. We are changing things up a slight bit. So if you've been with us for a while, you know that we kind of have a 6-in-1 rhythm that we were trying to embody of 6 episodes and then taking a break. Sometimes that break was a few weeks. Sometimes that break was a few months. And we are going to change that rhythm in order to kind of adopt the language and the flow of 40 Orchards. And as you know, this is a 40 Orchards podcast. We are all connected to 40 Orchards. Lisa and Steph are co-directors. I'm on the board. And so we are excited to kind of operate in this new flow. And so 40 Orchards, and we'll link in the show notes to all of this, but they have these 2 new programs they're calling 7 Circles and 7 Hours. And so we want to highlight those and point you to those at 40orchards.org so you can check those out and get connected to what they're doing there. But because they got this theme of 7, we thought it would be fun on the podcast to also embody this idea of 7. And so we're going to do 7 episode seasons during this year. And we are going to first look at 7 gardens. And so we're going to be diving into different imagery and ideas surrounding different gardens that we see throughout Scripture. And so that's a long-winded way of saying, Lisa, would you mind reading from Genesis chapter 2, where we see the first garden?
Yeah. I'm going to read from the Inclusive Bible for this reading, and then I'm just going to do verses 7 through 9 to start. I'm also going to translate it a little different than the translation translates it. So, because you can do that when you want to. So I'm going to do it. So the living presence fashioned an earth creature out of the clay of the earth and blew into its nostrils the breath of life. And the earth creature became a living being. The living presence planted a garden to the east in Eden, land of pleasure, and placed in it the earth creature that had been made. Then the living presence caused every kind of tree, enticing to look at and good to eat, to spring from the soil. In the center of the garden was the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Okay.
Fun translation.
Isn't it, though?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I love, it's just kicking us off on the right foot to notice, I think, that the living presence is creating an earth creature. So most translations are going to say, the Lord God formed a man of the dust of the ground in verse 7. That would be a more common translation. And so I'm curious how it feels to just start in this other place where instead of hearing the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, we're hearing the living presence. Was it formed, Lisa, or was it something else?
Fashioned.
An earth creature.
Good. What was it like reading it that way?
Well, I like this translation. And I think that's part of the loosening for me of like when I read man, I always read it as like a man, not like human.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so there's a particularly when I think about it as a like earth creature, just loosens all of it for me that it's a different image than what's in my head when I hear it, like God made a man.
Mm-hmm.
I do kind of like the idea, like clay of the earth. I know what that feels like. Like, like when you get into that formidable earth, and that feels different than dust for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's oftentimes what I was like, hear it as.
Okay, so let me play the part of the skeptic just for the fun of the conversation. So why did you feel the freedom to use a translation or even maybe translate some of that yourself as, not only the living presence, which I think we all know, if you've been a part of Searching the Sacred or 40 Orchards, do you know where that comes from? We can dive into that for a brief minute, but the earth creature as opposed to man, or male, like why that translation?
Why did I choose the translation?
Why do you think that's an appropriate? Why do you think that's an appropriate translation as opposed to every other translation that doesn't use that?
Well, we should always notice that every translation has a different way of translating. And almost every translation is done by people who are pretty smart. Like most of them have had some sort of education. And we're working with an old language. So, like biblical Hebrew is an old language. And so everybody's kind of guessing a little bit at what we're doing. So it's helpful to have actually lots of translations. And I mean, I think the more that I study it, the more comfortable I am with finding ones that I'm comfortable with.
Hmm.
And having spent, enough time, I feel like I don't even know that you have to. But I feel like, I mean, I went and got my MDiv and I learned how to do some translation work. So I feel comfortable with some of that. Like, I'm not saying that's the only way to translate it, but for me, it's a helpful way to translate it
Mhm.
because it expands how I understand the story.
Hmm.
And I'll add a little to that of in verse 23 of this same chapter is when we get to the creation of woman and man. And she is called woman because she was taken out of man, is that translation. And I would say I'm fine actually with that use of woman and man because those two are more typically gendered words. It's ish and isha. So those are more clearly trying to do something with gender, with woman and man, ish and isha. Whereas in and ish is man and isha is woman. When we're talking about the earth creature, as Lisa's translate, and we can still also, by the way, there's a big conversation to be had about gender in that I'm just sitting to the side. But for verse 7, it's just worth noting that it is neither Ish nor Isha. It is Adam. And Adam is better translated, in my opinion, and I think Lisa's, that's why she chose it, as human than man.
Hmm.
It is used as man because in the same way that English used to use man as an all-encompassing, like,
All men are created equal kind of thing.
yes, I was actually thinking like Declaration of Independence. Although I would say Thomas Jefferson, I think, did mean men, but I think we interpret it as humans, whether or not that's what. But that it was typical that man meant humans, and so in that way, it would be okay to say man. But the idea of it is not about gender; it's about something else, and that's most clear in verse 7, actually, because God is forming or fashioning the Adam from the Adamah. And so in
that the makes it more of a like prototype or like almost more of like a it's set apart in a way. It's not just like I'm explaining to you what happened. It's like this is a thing.
Yeah, and and in Hebrew you can see more what the play really is. I think we get distracted by the wrong, like that the Adam is being made from the Adamah. The connection is about the human to the earth, where earth creature is the right. I would argue it's a better translation to get us to feel what the verse is saying, which we are earth creatures made from the earth. That is the source of the human being. And the human was made from the earth. The earthling was made from the earth. Like that.
The earthling. I love it.
Right. That's more what it sounds like in Hebrew. The earthling was made from the earth. Is closer.
Like a Martian
a
Martian lives on Mars. The earthling lives on Earth. Right.
Yeah. But even more than lives, was made from.
Right.
Was fashioned from. The word is yatsar, which is like formed or fashioned. The way a potter forms or fashions a piece of pottery.
That's really cool. No, and I really appreciate you guys diving in and giving a little bit more context or a little bit more even language nuance to that, because I grew up all my life hearing, the Lord God created a man, right? And that male then got told a bunch of stuff and then eventually fell asleep and then had a rib taken out, and then ta-da, we have a perfect partner to be connected to this person. And it wasn't until grad school in a class on feminist theology where a guest professor came in and walked us through Genesis chapter 2 and was like, have you any of you heard of a different way of translating these words? And we were like, well, no. And it was like all these little light bulbs are going off, and some of us, our light bulbs are bursting. And like, I mean, it was a fun moment. And so I really appreciated, Lisa, that you read it that way, because it reminded me of that kind of aha moment of like, whoa, this text is more dynamic than I thought it was. And it's potentially doing something that it's so sad that the church has lost that nuance all these years, or at least parts of it, parts
Well,
of the church.
and I think there's so much, there's a lot of time spent in this passage, not necessarily reading it, but like talking about it, that it becomes like, oh yeah, I know what it is. And so even reading it is sometimes takes you a minute, or even, I was like, it's not very often that I think about, my relationship to the earth in a way that is rooted in the idea that I came from the earth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because like there's, I don't know, it's distance of like, understand, I have parents, and how we treat the earth and how we engage with the earth is different. Like, it's not like, I don't know, it just feels very distant to think about being formed. Like, why would that be part of the story, or the, like, what's that doing?
Right. Well, it's like when you hear that, the idea that we're formed and fashioned from this thing, we're connected to it. Like literally, it's like almost like our DNA is like in there, like it's part of it. And then you hear something like the practice of forest bathing being a helpful thing for the healing of the body from like as a medical way of giving somebody a prescription for something. It's not for a pill, it's to go lay down in the woods or to go for a walk, and just be in nature is actually going to help heal you. It's like, oh, maybe that's a Genesis 2 moment. And I know that practice,
go touch grass is the,
Shinrin Yoku, right? It's a Japanese practice that we've now called forest bathing here, but yeah, it's just beautiful.
Well, and it's such a as you talked about, I want to go back to people's minds being blown and what that person said and kind of how you responded to it, even because I think it's curious to me how much we have lost this idea because we've had so many conversations about gender and sin in Genesis that we've missed the earthling part. And that missing the earthling part affects how we hear then Jesus's words later of like, if everything is about some eternal destination after we die, then this earth doesn't matter. As like so many people's theology, but Genesis 2, so like from the very beginning, we are deeply, deeply connected to this earth. We are made from this earth. And that feels like just something we can't go past without talking about. Like, what are the consequences to losing that, which so many people of faith have done. They've lost that the earth is our home.
Yeah. I always heard, growing up, and then even in, my time in some more conservative veins of Christian higher ed, talking about, well, don't worry, we're just going to get a new heaven and a new earth. And that's what we have to hope for, is the new earth and the new heaven and then, the new, and where God's going to give us something new and it's going to be perfect. And when you really dive into the language, even in that New Testament idea of a new heaven and a new earth, it's the same language for when we're called upon to be a transformed Christ follower and we're to be a new creation in Christ Jesus. That language of being a new creation in Christ Jesus is the same language that's being used for a new heaven and a new earth. Well, I'm sorry, that's something that I'm supposed to embody right now in my human flesh and in my current mind, in my current soul, in my current being. I'm to be a new creation. Not sometime in the future, not sometime after I die. Right now, I'm supposed to be a new creation. And so when we talk about a new heaven and a new earth, it's not something that is like out there separate from us that is going to be like gifted to us later. It's actually a transformative process that we get to be a part of, right? So like I'm constantly in the mode of becoming more Christ-like, just like I should be helping facilitate the earth moving towards this new creation where it actually works together as opposed in opposition. which kind of sounds a little bit like Genesis chapter 2, maybe, just to bring us back around.
Why do you think that other interpretation of connecting us to the earth that you heard back in that class? Why do you think that was mind blowing? Like, why do you think we've lost that?
Well, patriarchy, number one. It was convenient and probably essential that men were seen as the dominant movers and shakers. And for centuries upon centuries, they were. And in a lot of regards, right now, still are. So let's not pretend like patriarchy's dead and everything's perfect, because it's not even close. But I think that translation made it really convenient and easy and necessary to keep that idea going. I think it's also a nice way to try to limit people's imagination, which I think, unfortunately, the Christian church has a good history of being both an incredible place of imagination and art, and to be one of the most stifling places of imagination and creativity. And when you tell half the population that you're less than, that stifles a lot of imagination and a lot of creativity and a lot of space to be empowered and to think and to become who you were designed to be. And so I think it was a nice control mechanism in a lot of ways. So yeah, that's like a really negative view of that.
Well, I'd maybe even push it a little bit further, because I think that the
Yeah.
stifling of one gender actually stifles all genders.
Oh, there it is.
Right? Like there's a way to read it, and it's just harmful to everyone.
Yes.
Because when I imagine what it's like and there are people who have this experience, which I'm a little bit jealous of, but to grow up and think that like God created you good and whole, and no matter what genitalia you have or gender you're assigned, like none of that is actually the thing. The thing is that as a person, whole and good, and not limited within your spirituality because of that, everything changes for everyone. How you hold people changes. And it's not about like who sinned first or who caused that's not even a part of the conversation. And so I think going back to like the original stuff, and I think that's part of it for me too, is I was taught it's about Paul, right? That Paul did a thing, but like that line actually leads all the way back to here when we think of if God made a man first, and woman wasn't even on the radar.
Right.
And that's kind of what happens when you read it, is like, God created a man. Look at that.
And then, oops, maybe.
Well, and then that the only suitable partner for a man is a woman, right?
Yes.
And that's the only option that we have. And I think one of the things that kind of, like I said, that kind of all the light bulbs went on and then all the light bulbs exploded, was not just that maybe we could interpret this a little differently, but then when God is talking about this earth creature needing some partner or companion, it wasn't sexual and it wasn't immediately the opposite gender. It was, we need to find something that can be in community equally with this. And that idea, just pausing there and not saying, and not adding on the sexual thing or not adding on the procreation thing, but just the idea of we're made for community, and that community doesn't have to be marriage, and it doesn't have to be sex, and it doesn't have to be procreation. Community just means community and like companionship and friendship, or and like having more than one human. Like it was like, whoa, if we just slow down and see that, it really changes the dynamic of what God is doing in this moment, as opposed to how we've just kind of ran with it to be like, this is why marriage is this way, or this is why this is the only thing that we can agree to. So I thought that was a pretty important piece of it too.
There's an old midrash. So we talk about doing midrash here, which is expanding how we like asking different questions, having different interpretations, seeking different things. So we practice midrash with the lowercase m. There's also midrash with the capital M. So there are old ancient documents of rabbis talking about their interpretation of the text. So like ancient commentaries would be another midrash capital M, and commentaries would be sort
like
of
the midrash, as opposed to, yeah, we're gonna do some midrash here.
right. Bereshit Rabbah is a midrash that was put together around year 500. So we are talking 1500 years ago. So when we think about where the world was at that point, this is a long time ago. And it's full of rabbinical interpretations of Genesis 1 and 2. In that book, there's a rabbi that says, this is going to sound, it's old language, so it's going to sound kind of old. So I'll read it and I'll unpack it, but I want to actually quote what it says. In the hour when the Holy One created the first human, he created him as an androgyny. As it is said, male and female, he created them. Said Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. In the hour when the Holy One created the first human, he created him double-faced. As it said, the back, Akor, before Kadim, you formed me. They objected to him, but it says he took one of his ribs, and he said to them, it means one of his sides, just as you would say the side of the tabernacle. So I'm going to unpack a bunch of that. So this rabbi back in 500 said that the Adam had all gender in it. That rabbi in 500 said the Adam of Genesis 2:7 as
this isn't some like 2024 woke interpretation. This is a 500 AD idea from a rabbi
that says, because in Genesis 1:27 it says male and female he created them, and then he looks at Genesis 2:7 and says it's the Adam, and then notices that when it is split, what we translate as ribs is actually salah, which is the word for the side of the tabernacle. Rib makes it sound small, where it looks more as though the Adam was split in the end of Genesis 2. That is a 1,500 year plus interpretation that there was an Adam that was split. So this isn't just modern feminist theology, as I'm saying.
Yeah.
There is a way the text has pointed to something wider for a while.
Yep.
And I think when we do think about then the way that that's been harmful to say there was a man created first, there was no woman yet, that sort of thing, that harms people. Gender is such a fluid conversation, right? To say that the original Adam included all ideas of gender in one human being, I think could be healing for a lot of people to really think about. The Adam had all gender inside. That Adam was formed from the dust of the earth. No matter where you find yourself, you are in that Adam. We are all from that Adam.
I think it's also worth paying attention to, like, if you hear that and your body starts reacting, or you start feeling frustrated or angry or upset about it, to wonder why. Like, what is it that is so upsetting? Right. Like, there's a way to get curious about the way that how we feel about when we hear something interpreted differently than how we might have been taught, and to wonder why that is.
Yeah.
What would be problematic with having the very first earthling that's formed have everything inside of it? Right. And so I think I know, because I immersed in it long enough that I know that it can cause not everything feels like a light bulb.
Right.
Yes. It feels like a gut punch.
Right. Yeah. And I
want to say that again. Not everything feels like a light bulb. Sometimes it feels like a gut punch. That is a good way.
I should say that I shouldn't speak for everybody in the class, actually. I don't know if all light bulbs went on. I think there was a lot of eyes that got wide, but I don't know if that meant a light bulb went on or if it was a gut punch and you just had a big expression. So,
and I think that there's ways to say this is not. There were other rabbis, even in that document that I read, disagreeing with this particular rabbi. This is not how you have to interpret it, but it is how you can interpret it. And it is a way that has been written down and recorded as an interpretation for over 1,000 years. And so it should have a place as a legitimate possibility, and it is not the only possibility. And I would say, even if one wants to resist that piece of the conversation, it is important to then look at the end of Genesis 2 and notice that rib makes it seem small. It's the only place it gets translated as rib, I believe. It's Selah, which is side, which is used as an elevated term for the sides of the tabernacle. And so it does, even if you would like to take a more gendered interpretation of the beginning of Genesis 2, the language of the end of Genesis 2 is very equal.
Mm.
And that also then has to be wrestled with.
So just maybe I'll read a little bit from the same translation that I read, that I started with, how they translate it in this, is that, so the earth creature gave names to all the cattle, all the birds of the air, and all the wild animals, but none of them proved to be a fitting companion. So the living presence made the earth creature fall into a deep sleep, and while it slept, God divided the earth creature in two, then closed up the flesh from its side. The living presence then fashioned the two halves into male and female and presented them to one another.
Mm.
And so in some, like this is taking that side language that Steph was talking about and actually puts it into place. And there's a way that you can translate it this way. It's the push. Somehow we were taught that like there's one translation and that's the only translation. So whatever translation happened to be in your pew is the one that's the one. But it turns out there are hundreds of translations, all of them trying to do the exact same thing, but with the same bias. Every single one's going to have a bias, and it's up for us to just sit in them and see what does it do? What does it expand? What is a challenge for it? Where does it impact us?
I love how generous you're being with translators and saying that they're all trying to do a good thing. I don't know if that's always the case. And not that they're trying to do a bad thing or a mean thing, but I mean, we know, and Steph, you've highlighted this in other podcasts about, the NIV did not use a single Jewish scholar or Jewish person to help with their translation. I mean, that's an issue when you're talking about the language, predominantly being Hebrew. To not have any Jewish scholars being a part of your translation team. I mean, you're probably making a choice. And maybe it's just pure arrogance, and that's not like meant to be bad, but it also is not probably the most hospitable thing to do with the language. And so, Lisa, you're wonderfully kind to say that they're all trying to do a good thing. But I think we have to be honest that, we might not always be able to trust every translation the same way.
Oh, I wasn't trusting them.
I know you weren't. I know you weren't saying every translation's a good one. I know you weren't saying that.
No,
you're
there's a bias.
Some
bias is really bad.
And I want to kind of go back up to verse 7 to talk about how any translation is going to be limited, because the end of verse 7 is also important to me. So we're talking, this gender conversation is very important. And so is the way verse 7 ends. And verse 7 ends, no matter the translation, it's going to not be enough because it will pick one word for something that should have multiple words. Because that Hebrew holds multiplicity in a way that English does not. And so English is going to be not insufficient here. So I'm curious what the human becomes at the end of verse 7 in your translation, Lisa.
A living being.
A living being. My translation says a living soul. I actually think the best translation would be to somehow have like a slash where we understand that soul is being, meaning nephesh is the word. Many of our religious understandings of the word soul would equate soul with spirit. But in Hebrew, soul is equated with your beingness. Your soul encompasses all of who you are. It includes your body. It includes your mind. It includes your heart. It includes your spirit. All of that is your nephesh. I actually think it's really important to then use the word soul for that, so that when we hear soul, we're understanding that the soul is the whole of our being. But because we hear soul as spirit, in some ways it's better to use the word being so we understand what's really being said. And I would somehow like to Like, I just want there to be like an asterisk next to the word nefesh for all of us to hear that in the Hebrew understanding, in Genesis 2:7, once the living presence breathes into this dust of the earth, that is when humans become a living nefesh. Our beingness, our soulness doesn't exist with the breath of God. And that's an important conversation to include all of it, because we've often had a disconnection between those parts of ourselves. Sometimes we struggle more with disconnection from our body. Sometimes we struggle more with disconnection from our heart. Sometimes it's that we have some spiritual life that's disconnected from both. But nefesh is all of it. Who I am is my nefesh. And that comes to life in Genesis 2:7 for all of us.
I love that. I think that's a really beautiful place to pause and just sit in for a moment, because we do, when we use words like any word can do this, but when we just kind of use terminology that we're so familiar with, like a living being, and we just move past it so quickly, that what you're causing us to do is sit in it for a minute and say, what is the nefesh? And what does it mean that became alive and living after God breathed into it? And it's this more dynamic, more inclusive, more robust idea of being human. I mean, and especially because the idea of a soul, like you said, it is so connected to spirit and this like thing that's within me, but it's really like outside of me. It's the thing that will live on, is what we often will hear, like your soul will live on. And yet what's being really grounded here, and I'm saying that word intentionally, what's really being grounded here is that our souls and our spirits it's all connected to the earth and to spirit. They're coming together in the human, and that's such a beautiful dynamic thing.
And it's also so intimate.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to think about the living presence forming this human and then breathing into this human, and then the human going from just being dust to being a living nefesh feels, in some ways, I'm going to say this really dramatically, like we don't need the rest of the Bible. Meaning, like, there's a sense that like this describes the human journey in certain ways, of like what it is to see that connection to the earth, but also to feel the difference between just being an earthling and being a living nefesh. And what is the journey from moving to being an earthling who is a living nefesh? Because it's not automatic. There's something there that like is transformative, is happening to that being, that I think happens to us. Where like, what does it mean to actually be a living nefesh, and what does that require differently than just being an earthling? If that makes, I don't know how to phrase it. It impacts me. I guess I like this verse a lot, and I like this word a lot. Because it feels like nefesh is important and living nefesh is important.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting, I think one of the things that happens, at least, I don't even know if it's fair to say Christians, there's a way that the story of Jesus and Jesus being born has almost replaced the idea of creation. So like we relate more to the story of Jesus than we do in the story of like this creational story. But it makes me wonder a little bit about why is it that we are formed from the earth instead of being born? Like the leap between the two, like for me, feels like the two rootings. What's different about them, and why is it so much? In lots of ways, I should be less related to Jesus in like terms of like, well, fully divine, fully human. I mean, I do think humans are divine, but that's a different story. Um,
That's like season 15. We'll get
yeah.
there.
But like, there's a way that it actually should be more like the story that I should connect deeply with, and somehow it feels just further out there because of them being created and not born. Does that make? I don't know. Like, it just makes me kind of wonder about like what is helpful in thinking about being created from the earth. What in the story of creation, like that was like after the animals, after all these other things have happened. Like we're not actually like. I think we want to think of ourselves as the first thought, the biggest, the cherry on the top of the sundae. But
Well, that is one of the interesting things about
way.
chapter. That is one of the interesting things about chapter 2 is that it does kind of seem to prioritize the human more than chapter 1. The poem in chapter 1, day 6 is where we get the creation of the human, but in chapter 2, it's a lot more murky that there seems to be a priority on the human and what the role and responsibility of the human is in the garden. We have less distinction about when other things were created. I mean, it just kind of like creation just kind of seems to happen in chapter 2 as opposed to the very meticulous days of creation from chapter 1. And so I don't think it's wrong to say that there's an emphasis or a priority or a uniqueness to being human in all of creation. But I think you're right that what chapter 2 is doing is also, it's again grounding us in creation, not some odd set apart idea outside of it.
It makes me think of, there's this verse in Isaiah that I really like. I think it's in 43, somewhere in the 40s. But it talks about the God who created you, O Jacob, and formed you, O Israel. And to me, that hits it a bit of what Lisa is saying, of both narratives exist. Humans are created and humans are formed. And there's ways that those things are the same, and there's ways that those things are different. In Genesis 1, we are created. In Genesis 2, we are formed. And in some ways, those are two different creation narratives existing side by side, which is a big mind-blowing thing for a lot of people to realize there are two creation stories in the Bible. One is Genesis 1, one is Genesis 2. They don't reconcile, nor do they need to reconcile. They're telling a different story about what it means to be made. One is telling the story of being created, one is telling the story of being formed. And how in our own lives have we also experienced both and need to hold both creation narratives in our own life side by side. I was created. I was born from a mother's womb. But that is not how I was formed. I was formed from a bunch of lived experiences that have made me who I am. Some of those beautiful and some of them terrible. But and in some ways, those formational experiences are making me more of who I was created to be. They're helping me return to that. And in some ways, those formational experiences make me someone new. But the formation is different than the creation. And it also is more ongoing. And the verb tense in verse 7 does have an imperfect verb tense, that the human is becoming a living nephesh. And I'm curious about how we are being invited to think about how we continue to be formed. How are we continuing to be formed into a living nephesh?
Can we just pause right there for a second and just hold on to what you just said? That it's a continuing process of being formed. It's not and then there was a formed earth creature, period. Like as if it's already done and it stopped. It's a relational, ongoing dynamic of becoming, as opposed to fixed, settled, done, no more work to be had here. I think one of the fallacies within Christianity is we like to put ed at the end of a lot of our verbs as opposed to ing, and the Bible is very, very ing and not very ed. So put that on a poster.
It's true. I mean, like, I'm looking at a translation that takes the imperfect tense and makes it ing. And so then that reads really different. That the living presence is forming the human from the soil of the ground. The living presence is blowing into the nostrils, and the human is becoming a living nefesh. Like it's all full of INGs.
I mean, if you just pause for a second and think about your own being, if you put that God formed me, there's a level of maybe like of tenderness in that, thinking that like, oh man, God did this beautiful thing and formed me, and now I am just on the path that God has for me. And it's all marked out and I can trust it. And there's an assurance, there's a confidence, there's a clarity. Yay, God, yay, me, like we're doing this, right? And that can feel really good. And a lot of people need that security and that confidence. But I'm also pretty confident that I'm not perfect. Just a little bit, confident about that. And I would like to think that as a human who's constantly evolving and changing and growing and given new information, that I might not have it all together. And so this idea of God still forming me, and that it's not just me having to discover what God, I gotta find the path that God originally had and get back on it, but that God and I are doing this thing together, and that God is still working on me and moving me and helping fix my trajectory at times, but that it's an ongoing relational dynamic as opposed to Jason's got a problem and needs to fix it to get back in line with God. But instead it's God kind of saying, hey, I'm going to nudge you every once in a while, or I'm going to need to do some real serious course correction here. Or, hey, let's nuance that a little bit. Let's not be so, black and white, in and out, right and wrong. Like let's figure out some dancing here. I love being human and having an interactive God as opposed to a God who like sits back and says, well, I already told you what you should do. That sounds like angry guy on the porch as opposed to caring, parent.
This is making me think about also that when there's something about when we say it's about formed, there is a place that it's past tense here, but there's okay, so verse 9. It's verse 9. Sorry, verse 8. We have the ing of the living presence is planting a garden. And there, that living presence places, is placing, so that keeps the ing, the human that had been formed. So that's where we have the ed. So there is a formation that's sort of like almost paused there. Like the human has been formed and now the human's placed, like directed towards the garden. But then in verse 15, we have all of this then ongoing language again. In verse 15, that human is now being nuach into the garden, which is to be comforted, or it's not just placed, it's like comforted into the garden. To till intend, sometimes it says in our translations. I'm curious what Lisa's translation has for it. The two verbs are eved and shamar, so it's to serve and to keep, to work and to guard,
Cultivate and care.
That part of the ongoing thing that I'm hearing you talk about, Jason, is like from the beginning we had a job to do that would keep forming us.
Mm-hmm.
And we also miss that. Like we just want to be thought of as we were formed. Like we want to end in verse 9. We were formed and God put us in the garden. Done.
Right.
But it keeps going. Okay, you've been formed. You've been put someplace. Now I'm going to push you a little further into that place and give you a job to do. And that's going to keep forming you.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Like these experiences and this work that you have to do is going to keep forming you. That's growth trajectory, growth mindset. That's evolution. That's different than just find out the right answers and then never think about it again.
And it gives us a little pause. Like I like there's a pause in verse 9 where like God is planting a garden. God like sets down the human in that garden and the human that has been formed. Like every once in a while I do want to kind of pause in my formation process, right? I'm like tired, can only read so many growth books. And there does seem to be like a pause there. God's planting the garden and humans are put there.
Yep.
And then in verse 15, there's more.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's time to keep going.
I also think we like to make it super complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, keep going. Say more about that, Lisa.
These instructions aren't very complicated. And if we think about being placed in a garden, I think we kind of understand what it means to cultivate and care for it. It's not a lot of questions about what it needs. And I think if we were to honestly think about like our communities and the people within them, it's not really hard to understand what we need and what it looks like to like cultivate and care for each other. There's a lot of things that get complicated, but mostly because we make them that way. Like it doesn't talk about like taking power or build houses, or it doesn't, there's not like get bigger, make it a bigger garden, spread the garden everywhere. It's just take care here. And I'm not tossing you out to it. I'm gently placing you in it because you are capable of doing it. This is what you are. This is part of who you are.
One of the other ways to translate the nuach of like being comforted is to rest into the garden. And I think that really plays with some of our ideas of rest, to what Lisa's saying of like, there's a rest that's actually a part of the work of doing what we're meant to do. This is different than the rest. Like Sabbath is stopping. That's a whole nother thing that's already been established, that we have a rhythm of stopping. That is a kind of rest. But there's another kind of rest that's this one, which is when we are placed where we are meant to be and we are given the job that is meant to be ours to do, and we do it. There's a rest for our nefesh. There's a rest for our souls that comes when we live in that sort of place. And God's giving humans that sort of existence. There's a meaning to it. There is something to be done. And it's, to Lisa's point, it's not as complicated as we think. Like cultivate and keep this garden, guard it and tend it. Learn some things about what it needs, which also means God left some things undone for the humans to do. Let's think about that too. Like if the garden needed tending, then it wasn't an English garden with hammocks for the humans. There was some left.
I think even those need some tending.
Yes.
Right. Well, yeah, you just don't see who's tending them because it's
right.
Whole other thing there.
It's a whole nother thing. Yeah.
But it does speak to, like it's not about a life of luxury,
right? And the rest comes through purpose.
Okay, let's just pause for a second and sit in this. Creation, there was things left to do, and the rest comes from purpose, not simply relaxing in luxury. I think that's a really beautiful entry into the Garden of Eden, and not one that we tend to hear, because we tend to hear the Garden of Eden was perfect, and if only we could get back to being perfect like the Garden of Eden. As opposed to...
hold on, Jason.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The word that is never used to describe the garden that probably most people think is there is the word perfect.
Exactly.
There is Genesis 1 and 2 does not contain the word perfect. It was never a perfect garden. It always had it. If it was it always had something to till and tend, and it was the Garden of Delight. It's not the Garden of Perfection. It's named the Garden of Delight. There's some delight in the work and the delight in relationships.
And can we just pause for a second and just say, like, the very nature of it being a garden means that it's not perfect? Like, I've never seen a perfect garden. I've seen gardens that are beautiful and gardens that have been weeded really well, but like come back the next day, right? There's somebody weeding the weeds. Like gardens are inherently going to need constant attention. You don't ever perfect a garden. Like that's this whole concept of if we could just blank, then we would have it perfect. It's a fallacy of being human that if we could just have blank, it would be perfect. Because if we trust the Bible at all, and we trust some of these very beautiful passages, like Paul writes, and I know Paul's got his stuff, but when Paul writes in that beautiful love chapter, that in the end we will have faith, hope, and love, and those will be the only thing that remain, and the greatest of these is love. I'm sorry, but like faith, hope, and love don't stop. You don't arrive at those and then think, well, the next day I guess I don't have to be hopeful anymore, or loving anymore, or have faith anymore. You don't get those and then just put them on the shelf for a while. You embody them all the time, or you don't. Like they're ongoing ideas, they're ongoing ways of being in the world. You're either a faithful person or not. You're either hopeful or not. You're either loving or not. You either embody it and continue it or you don't. Just like a garden, it either continues with health and being a garden of delight, or it becomes something else because you forget to do your job. You forget to keep at it and to keep finding purpose and meaning, and you think you can just hang up a hammock and rest for a while.
I was
Sorry, I got done preaching. So
you had a sermon. Like I was like, oh, that wasn't quite where I was, but it's a good sermon. What I was thinking was,
hold on. Before you say that, though, Lisa, that's a good place to pause for our podcast listeners and to say, some of you were right where Jason was, and you're like, preach that sermon. That's amazing. But this is the beauty of studying in community. Is Lisa saying that's not where I was? Now I'm going to take it in a different direction, and to say, can we release ideas of right and wrong here, or like that? There's like Jason just gave us the only interpretation of this passage. Jason took it to one place, and now Lisa's going to take it someplace else. And that's as it should be. That is the beauty of communal voices helping us see scripture. So
and
Lisa,
I just laugh. I just laugh because I know Lisa's like always going to be off different from where I am.
This is going to be a much like, this is actually going to be very like, oh. But all I could hear. So I was thinking about like the Garden of Delight, and the Garden of Delight actually having like this work to be done. And in gardening, we have we have some plants out front, and there's a way that I can look at it when it blooms, all the flowers. I'm like, oh, it's just so pretty. God, it smells so good. It's so pretty. And then like when the flowers start to die off, it's like, oh. But if I were to just look at it, I could probably find beauty in it in some way. Like there's a way to look at, like, even though that brown flower is not the same as it was before, it looks like it's dying. It looks like but it's also like doing a thing with its seeds. And so there's like part of that life cycle thing. But I just kept thinking, all I could hear was Bob Ross saying like happy little accidents. And there's a way that actually, like the Garden of Delight has a lot of happy little accidents inside of it. It's not meant to be perfect. It's not meant to have everything this picturesque. It's going to cultivate life and death. That's part of the cycles of all of it. It's not meant to be a thing that's it's like right-siding some of our ideas of like what it means to delight in something and to delight in, to live inside of that while also still holding all those other things that are true. What doesn't make it delightful is that it's perfect.
I want to hone in even more so on that fact, because not only is it not described as perfect, there is a moment in verse 18 where the living presence says, it is not tov that the Adam should be alone. So not only is it not perfect, there is something not tov after, like where if God was trying to create something that was like done, it would have been tov and it would have been perfect, but that's not. There was a discovery needed. There was a co-creation needed. It was something was set in motion that God wanted the humans to participate in. And so the human needs to be a part of seeing what is and isn't tov, and what it looks like for that goodness to be, for the human to be part of that goodness motion. And the garden isn't what we think it is. It's delightful for a different set of reasons than we thought it's delightful, I think.
And for anyone that's like confused about this idea of Tov and like, well, I thought in like the whole chapter 1, Tov, 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 and then very Tov, and like, or Tov, Tov, right? Like, you might be asking the question, well, I thought that when God created humans, it was Tov. Yes, in chapter 1, in that creation narrative, when God creates humans in our image, plural, multiple, community, it is Tov. But in chapter 2, when there is a flesh, earth creature who has the breath of life in it and is placed in the garden singularly, it isn't yet Tov. It's got responsibility. It's got the breath of life, but it does not yet have community. And so there is something not yet Tov about that existence in this moment. And that's what Steph is highlighting, that idea of we're not there yet. And which is totally separate from chapter 1, but could be confusing for anyone that's looked at these together and thought, well, I thought it was good. Why are you telling me it's not? Different creation narratives and at a different moment in creation as it's being formed and fashioned and done.
Yeah, that yet I think is important. Even in the chapter 1 idea, I think we've also been sold a bill of goods about that, because it's that idea of very good has often been about, oh, humans are the pinnacle of creation. Humans are the only thing that is called Tov Meod, very good. Except actually that's not true. It's the verse says when God looked at the whole of what God had made, all of it was very good, meaning humans are actually never called Tov Meod except for our connection to the whole of what has been made, which then points to the same idea here. Unless there is this like co-creation, interdependent, communal thing, it's not yet Tov. Which also means it's not perfect, because that's not the point. It's a garden. It's a garden of delight. All of it is beautiful.
And I appreciate that Lisa brought us to that idea of even when the quote unquote beauty of the garden goes away, when the flower's not in bloom, when the leaves wither and they fall and you're left with a bare tree, like there's actually so much beauty that can still be found if you have the imagination to just pause and sit in, like, okay, what is miraculously happening right now in this thing? And I mean, we don't need to go down this path because we're not arborists or anything, but like there is so much beauty in how plant life like takes care of itself and takes care of each other, and we get to participate in that and help cultivate it. But like there is so much dynamic growth and change happening that we don't even get to see, but we know is there, like beneath the surface or within the plant itself.
Well, I feel like part of what's beautiful, it's opening up that beauty is about the process, not just about the product. And to say a part of what's beautiful about that moment in time is if we have a job to do of guarding and cultivating and working this garden, then that transition point is our next point of discovery for the next thing that's ours to do. Oh, how does this plant now need to be cared for? And what now does this garden need? And it reminds me of the concept of the three sisters in, I love the book Braiding Sweetgrass. That's where I really heard about this, where there was an indigenous practice of planting, I believe it's corn and beans and squash together, because of the way that their life cycles create a natural interdependency where the corn grows tall and the corn then becomes the thing that the vine of the pea plants can climb. And the squash provides the ground cover that then helps with like other plants not invading.
Mhm.
And they bear their fruit at different times so that they don't like cut off life from each other. They need a different amount of water at different times. So like if you plant those three things together, when one dies, the other is thriving. Or when one is done providing fruit, the other one starts providing fruit. And there's something in that, in like learning that process that is beautiful, of learning that like, oh, this thing even has a role to play now that it has stopped bearing fruit, because it can help this next thing bear fruit. It's a
Mhm.
different kind of beauty than just look at this one singular beautiful. It's like there's a part of that work and interdependency that makes things beautiful
Mhm.
that you start to learn, especially if you can talk about it better than I just did, because I am not an expert gardener. And I probably just described it wrong. So somebody can correct. But
But I think what you're highlighting, stuff that's really important, is that when the human is placed in this garden to tend it and to guard it and to cultivate it and to help it, that you're giving us a really good example of how a group of people figured out a way to help it thrive in its fullness. And they didn't just go, oh, plants, cool, they're perfect, I don't have to do anything, just wait for them to harvest. It's like, well, actually, if we put these three together, like, it will be even more abundant, and it will even be more protected, and it will flourish even more than what we anticipated. And it will be natural and not chemical, right? Like, it will actually work with the earth and help it cultivate its own health, as opposed to forcing that upon it.
Well, because in some ways it's, well, the antithesis to Western thought on production. It is, it is not about like making everything the biggest, best, most thing, right? Like getting every single. You have to leave some stuff, right? You can't just, you can't take everything. You have to leave some, and you're letting it make into compost. You're like, there's a natural process to a lot of things that is not about like making the most out of everything. It is actually about what things help each other, what things work with each other, instead of like forcing things to do the things that we want them to do, and instead paying attention. And that is where indigenous, I mean, and specifically when we're talking about farming, um, indigenous folks have a lot to teach us about how to actually like preserve land instead of
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
getting the most production out of everything.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
like
There's
Which that
we're in a totally different world.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I need to, I don't know what you're going to say, Jason, but I was wanting to push us towards a bit of a closure.
I'll just add one little quick thing, and then you close this up. There's a really funny story that this director of the Rodale Institute, which works on organic farming and healthy farming practices, they were getting this big garden started in Pennsylvania, and they had it going for a while, and then they needed to go to this conference, and so they went to the local Quaker community, who also had a farm nearby, and they said, "Can you watch our farm?" And they said, "Yes." And they said, "We just want you to know that it's an organic farm, and we don't use any chemicals. And, we just wanted to let you know." And they go, "Oh, you mean farming?" They were like, "That's what it's called. Like, you don't need to put organic before it. It's just farming. Like, period. We've been doing that for a while." They, it's just their reaction was like, "Yeah, we know what that means."
Which I think
Mhm.
I would say there's a question for us to hold about how it still is our job as humans to cultivate and guard. And that what we're often bumping into is not being clear on what it is we're guarding and what it is we're cultivating. And that I would actually say that that's a core conflict that Jesus is having with the Pharisees, as they understand the role of guarding differently. And that still is something we bump into today. What are we guarding? Why are we guarding it? Are we guarding the land? Are we guarding the production? Are we guarding the beauty? Are we guarding the power? And this idea of the humans finding rest inside of the purpose of working and guarding an interdependent communal garden of delight feels like it can still guide our lives towards a place of flourishing if we wrestle with what that looks like in the modern world. What am I guarding? What is my work for? And how can I return more deeply to the roots of Genesis 2 and what humans are meant to guard and meant to work for?
See you next week. This has been a 40 Orchards podcast. At 40 Orchards, our mission is to create circles for all people to wrestle through biblical text so that together we can expand each other's experience of what is sacred, whole, and good. We search through the lens of sacred possibility, assuming there is more to be discovered, questioned, and applied as we listen for how God is still speaking. You can learn more about 40 Orchards and sign up for a study by going to 40, that's 40orchards.org. Our opening music is by Les FM. Our closing music is by NCR Music Vibes. Additional music is by 3 Music. Any references to books or other sources can be found in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for searching the sacred.